Okay. In this final video on traits, we will go over a couple of other contemporary approaches. So the first thing I want to touch on here is there has been some discussion on whether or not there should be a sixth dimension added to the factor model, and this dimension would be an honesty, humility dimension. And so basically what would happen with this is that this dimension would basically be created from taking away some traits that have typically otherwise been in the agreeableness dimension. And so basically you can think about this potential addition as more of like a pro versus anti-social dimension. And so there will be high scores being that sincere or honest side of things versus lower scores being more of an exploitative um, personality or dimension. And so what would be included under that more exploitative side of things are traits such as Machiavellian, sorry. And so that is kind of like sly and manipulative, versus there's also the trait of psychopathy, which is more along the lines of lacking empathy or insight into others, being insensitive, impulsivity for sure. And then finally, the last of that dark triad is narcissism. Talk about that a bit more on the next slide, actually, but this is involved with being arrogant and very self-centered. And so kind of maybe an interesting person slash example of this dark triad would be Putin, who is definitely manipulative in how he interacts with others and with international politics. Certainly seems to have a lack of empathy for others and is certainly not lacking self-esteem, and certainly sees himself in a high light. But anyways, one just really weird slash interesting Putin thing is he consistently over the years throws himself a birthday ice hockey match, and where in this game somehow he is able to score multiple times, such as 7 times in this game. I doubt he's that good of hockey. He's probably legitimately that people playing against him are worried for their safety if they stop him from scoring. But more broadly, this dark triad is linked to things like bad workplace behavior, prejudice, crime, exploitative sexual behavior, sexual violence, aggression, sexual aggression, rape, all those things would be various behaviors associated with that dark triad. So a little bit more on narcissism here. Narcissism, essentially, we're not that great at measuring narcissism, and it's often conflated with self-esteem. And so when we measure these two things, there seems to be quite a bit of association there, which is not great because they are conceptually distinct, and kind of emphasizing that distinction is these paranoid thoughts. But those who are narcissistic, they believe that they are uniquely great, but they are also concerned with others, not in the sense that they're actually want to know about the others, but they're concerned with what others view, how others think of them, and how others view them. And this leads to some paranoid thoughts. And so there is this heightened attention just meaning heightened concern with the others, and this leads to paranoia that, well, I know I'm great, but what if others don't see this greatness in me that I see? And so that's that paranoid thought here. And that's a major difference between narcissism and self-esteem. Is just self-esteem, you actually see a negative correlation with paranoid thought. So less paranoid thought with more self-esteem. And then additionally, we have these conspiracy beliefs, which paranoid thought is also sometimes it's not too strong of a correlation, but certainly a meaningful one. Leads to more conspiracy beliefs. From the narcissism standpoint, this happens due to the thought process of like, oh, I'm great, right? So this can't be my fault. So it's coming up with other reasons that aren't very plausible for explaining certain things that happen, that a narcissist wouldn't want to attribute to themselves. Now, finally, getting into what I briefly brought up that we and said we would talk about, is these idiographic approaches. And so this gets more less at personality traits over situations. And so this is at more asking the question of what is uniquely special about each person. And so those studying under the idiographic approach like to point out this nomothetic fallacy, which is where an observer or an experimenter believes that situations are indicative of the same trait, whereas the participant or the person actually, completing these behaviors in various situations views the situations differently. So in other words, the fallacy in this sense is that there's a belief that each situation is the same for different people, which studies under this idiographic approach show that that's not the case. And so for an example, one trait to think about could be being talkative. And so maybe I define talkativeness as being more likely to go talk to strangers the first time you meet a new person or whatever, versus you might see talkativeness as being obnoxious and not caring about others, which would be more under that agreeableness dimension. But basically, this is just to say that how each person sees talkativeness could depend on the situation, and there could also just be in general different views about what talkativeness actually is. So yeah, they're basically the key point of the idiographic approach is that when just looking at traits across situations, important details of personality are overlooked in search for factors that explain the most variance. So even though these factors or dimensions are explaining quite a bit of variance, they're also missing quite a bit that could maybe be due to really the want or the need for the best efficiency with these factors. And so what comes with that might also be missing certain explanations of variance and behavior for different situations. And so there is a need based on this approach to include the situation as well. And so a big figure, Walter Mischel. And so this is taking the situation side of things as opposed to that nomothetic approach is more the person. And so this, get into this a little bit more on the next slide, but for a very long time in psychology, and still to this day, there is a person versus situation debate. Basically, the debate is whether certain behaviors in any given situation are due to the person and the traits that person has, or whether it's due more to whatever the situational constraints are. And so, yeah, Walter Mischel was all about researching behavior within situations, but across different people, as opposed to looking at behavior and traits across situations. And so there's this idea of equivalence here, and this idea from Walter Mischel is that equivalence is determined by outcomes as perceived by the person, as opposed to the observer or the researcher. And so the perception by the person is just otherwise known as equifinality. And so more on this person versus situation debate, and the kind of want to point out the importance of the situation here. So the ideographic approach idea is that the situation is not just noise that needs to be eliminated, which is kind of the viewpoint of that nomothetic approach, but is actually a meaningful determinant of behavior. So a way of pointing that out, we have Harry and Luis here. And so let's say that they are, filling out that questionnaire, and the honesty dimension has been added. And so they're answering questions about honesty, and they are typically answering these questions such as, do you cheat, as a 3 out of 5. So in other words, sometimes I'm honest, sometimes I'm not. And so based on a nomothetic approach, this might be viewed more as, okay, so in every situation, you're going to cheat a little bit. But we see that that's not always the case. And so just for an example, this depends on the situation. So in an academic context, even though, both these individuals hypothetically put 3 out of 5 under do you cheat, in an academic context, Harry might be honest, whereas Luis might cheat. However, this might switch in different contexts, such as a sports context, where now Harry might cheat and Luis might be honest. So in other words, this is just to show that if the whole purpose of this research is to predict behavior, right, then adding the situation, thinking about the situation and looking at behavior from within situations, not just across situations, will allow us to become better predictors of behavior. And that is it for traits. So the next section that we'll be talking about is needs.